Now, in order to output some dynamic user data here, we first of all need to draw a random user. And to do that, I'll go to this user component class here, and for the first time in this course, I'll add some code to the body of that class. Because that is something you can do with Angular components and something you sometimes need to do, even though we haven't done it thus far. But thus far, we also didn't deal with any data that would need to be output on the screen. And that's what changes now. Now, in this user component class, when using TypeScript, as we do here, you can add a new property. For example, selected user. Though the name is totally up to you. But you can simply add a variable, you could say, like this in the class body, just without let or const in front of it. You just add the name instead. And then you can use an equal sign to assign a value to this property. And this property and its value will then be made available by Angular to the template of this component. And that's why we're doing this here. So now the value I want to add here should be one of the users from that dummy users.ts file. So I need to draw a random user from there. Now to do that, we can start by importing this dummy users array from going up one level from inside this user component to go out of this user folder, because the dummy users TS file is one folder above the user folder. And then we want to target this dummy users.ts file. With that, I'm now importing this dummy users array. Now I want to draw a user from there, and we could do this by using the square bracket notation to, for example, access the first user, or the second one, and so on. Just as you know it from JavaScript arrays. Now, of course, that's not random though. That is a fixed number. To make this random, we can create a little helper constant here outside of this class and name it random index, for example, and then get a random number that's within the range of available indexes of this array by using math floor and then math random times dummy users dot length. And this should give me a random number that's between 0 and the highest available index of that array. And we can now use this random index constant here instead of that 0 to access a user at that random index. Now, that's all nice, but what's the advantage of that? Well, the advantage is that we can now access this selected user property from inside the template of this component. So all the properties you are defining in your component class are available in the template of that component. That is a core feature of Angular. Therefore, we can go to this user component HTML file, and we can now output the name of that selected user. But how does that now work? When it comes to outputting dynamic content in Angular applications, you get two main ways of binding your template or parts of your template to values generated by the component class, so to the selected user property, for example. And the first way of binding a part of your template is by using so-called string interpolation, which you do by using two opening and closing curly braces, like this. So opening and closing double curly braces. And then between those curly braces, you can now reference any public property of your component class. And this is a public property. You could mark it as private by adding private in front of it. Then it would not be available in the template. It would then only be available within the class. But that's not what we want here. So by not adding private, it will automatically be public. And therefore, in the user component template file, you can now target selected user. And you should be getting some IDE support here, if you're using Visual Studio Code, for example. And then use the dot notation on that property, because the value stored in that property will be such a user object. Keep in mind that dummy users is an array full of objects that look like this. So that have an ID, a name, and an avatar. And therefore here we can access dot name. And again, you should be getting some IDE support here, since the IDE, thanks to some tools provided under the hood by Angular, understands this connection between template and component class and the structure of our data. And this is then how you can output dynamic text or dynamic content in general in your templates by using this string interpolation feature with the double curly braces. If you do that and you save everything, you should then see that every time you reload this application, you're seeing a different name. Well, you might sometimes see the same name twice in a row because it is random, but it should change fairly frequently. Now, string interpolation with the double curly braces is one of the key features offered by Angular when it comes to outputting content in your template. Another crucial syntax or feature offered by Angular is the so-called property binding syntax. Because we of course also want to make sure that we show an image of the user. And for that we need to set the source attribute, for example. Now you could indeed do that by also using the double curly braces syntax between those quotes, because you can use it anywhere in your template, not just between tags as we're doing it here. So you could then access selecteduser.avatar. And if you would do that and save everything, you should see some output here. Actually not the image yet, because the path is not entirely correct yet, but you see that something changed. However, you would typically not use string interpolation for attributes like this. You typically only use it between tags as we're doing it here. Instead, in cases like this, if you want to configure an element through its attributes, you would typically use another core Angular feature called property binding, which looks like this. You don't have curly braces. Instead, you wrap the name of the property of the DOM element you want to configure, so of this image element in this case, you wrap the name of the property that should be set with square brackets. So opening and closing square brackets around the property name. And then inside of those quotes, you set the value that should be assigned to this property without curly braces. Now, selected user avatar is actually not entirely correct because those images are stored in the assets folder and they are in the users folder. So the image name alone is not enough. And that's why we here actually want to construct a dynamic path and concatenate that with selected user avatar. And then in that string created with single quotes here, since I'm using double quotes to wrap the overall value, we set up the rest of the path, which is assets/users/ and then the name of the user image file. And that is something you can do in Angular. You cannot just reference properties in places where you reference dynamic data, but you can also create dynamic values just in time, so to say. As I'm doing it here by constructing a string from a fixed string that's then combined with that value that's stored in the avatar property of the selected user. And we could have done something similar down here with string interpolation as well. You can also have other JavaScript expressions like 1+1 in there if you needed it. But in most cases, you will indeed refer to properties and any values stored inside of them, just as we're doing it here. Well, and with that, to finish this image, I also want to bind the alt property on the image tag, on the image element, and I'll bind this to selected user.name again. And then I'll press the code formatting shortcut that's built into Visual Studio Code so that the code gets formatted like this and is a bit easier to read. And with all that done, if you now save that, you should see that if you now reload, you also got an image here next to that name that changes with every reload. And that is how you can output dynamic data in your Angular apps. And string interpolation and property binding are two of the most important features you have to know when working with Angular, because in the end, Angular is all about building dynamic, interactive web applications, and that of course implies that you must be able to output dynamic data. So you did now learn how you can output dynamic data in your templates with help of string interpolation and property binding. Now you will fairly often have cases like this where you might need to compute a value that should be output. So where you maybe need to construct a value like this string here, which consists of multiple values. In this case, the avatar property of the selected user object and this fixed string. And as you can of course see, you can do this directly inside of the template. However, it is considered a better practice to keep your template code, the dynamic template code, fairly simple and to outsource computations like this into a different place. That's why I will cut this dynamic value from the user component HTML file, and instead I'll use another TypeScript and JavaScript feature that you can use in classes. I'll add a so-called getter. By adding the get keyword and then any identifier of your choice. For example, image path, though that name is up to you. Then you add opening and closing parentheses and then opening and closing curly braces. And this creates a so-called getter. It's essentially a method, so a function inside of a class, that's usable like a property, so that does not need to be called and executed explicitly, and that's meant to produce and return a new value. And the new value that should be produced and returned here is that path to the image. Now here I'm now referring to that selected user property, and since I'm now doing this from inside the class instead of from inside the template as we did it before, we must add the this keyword and a dot in front of that. Because that's how in JavaScript, it's not TypeScript specific, but in JavaScript, how you access properties of a class from within that same class. So with the this keyword, we access this class, so to say, to which this getter belongs, and we can then get hold of the different other properties that may be defined in that class, like this selected user property. And with that, we now got this image path getter, and you can now use that getter just like any other property in your template. So here, as a value for the source property, we can now use this image path like this. As I mentioned, like a property. So you don't execute it, you don't add parentheses, even though it's defined like a method here, but because it's such a getter, because of that get keyword, you use it like a property, like this. And with that, you'll get the same result as before, but now the template is written in a cleaner way.